Thank you. My main message today is that world trade actually has recovered. We are right now at the all-time high levels at a quarterly basis. You might recall what happened in late 2008 and the steep decline of world trade that we had during the fourth quarter of 2008 and during a fair share of 2009. But already in the fourth quarter of 2010, world trade has recovered to the previous all-time high levels, and 2011 has been another good year for international trade. We have had a volume growth of about 6%. So we are right now at the best levels that we have ever had. Although this growth is unevenly distributed in the sense that there is, as everyone knows, a long-term shift from the old industrial core to new advanced emerging economies, mainly in Northeast and Southeast Asia. So what we can see right now is that China is still the engine for world trade growth, but an interesting phenomenon that we are looking at right now is that China is increasingly also turning inwards. China has been an export-driven economy for a long time, and now we can see that the domestic trade and the domestic growth rates, particularly in the Chinese inland provinces, have increased much more than in the coastal provinces. So this is also a long-term trend that we have been interested in. However, the most interesting trend when it comes to trade related to East Asia is the intra-trade growth. Intra-trade is the trade between neighbors in Asia. And this has for a long time been also the engine of world trade growth in general. It is trade between China and Korea, Japan, China, Southeast Asian countries in the region ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. That is actually where we can find the highest growth levels right now. And what is interesting is that compared to Europe, this has been a trend that has not been promoted by the political side, but at the business level. So the division of labor and specialization within Asian countries is more or less despite the political level than because of political incentives to promote intra-regional growth. So this is something that is indeed very strong. What we can see from the European level is that the European part of what we call global production networks or global value chains have slowly but steadily declined. And this is, of course, bad news for European trade. Even though the largest volumes are still to be found in intra-trade in Europe, there is, when we look at the figures for 10, 15 years, a trend that more and more value in terms of the relative size is actually leaving Europe and move to East and Southeast Asia. So the implications for Sweden is, from that point of view, a little sad. The Swedish figures have been very stable. Sweden is heavily embedded in the European production network, and if we look at the figures since 10, 20 years back, we can see that it's about the same level. But at the same time, Swedish industry has become more and more dependent on what is happening in East and Southeast Asia. However, it's a long-term trend, and it's not really visible at a 1 to another year basis. So the explanation, what we try to look at in my field, where we follow international trade and foreign direct investment, is the continuous development, what we call from trade in products to trade in tasks. Trade in task is the phenomenon where trade has become more and more specialized in particularly the intermediate side, and we see that about 75 to 80% of world trade actually consists of complicated, long value chains, and these global production networks have, from that point of view, been an advantage to Swedish industry, who is very much located in the center of these global value chains. However, there is a trend of moving production and tasks from the European arena to East and Southeast Asia at an increasing level, although this is a very long and slow trend, but it is evident. Looking at other parts of the world, for instance, Africa, it has been a long discussion on the growth of Africa recently. Yes, the figures are good, and African countries have faced a nice economic growth during the last years, 2010 and 2011, and we expect another good year in 2012. However, we have to keep in mind that this is a growth from very, very low levels. So in absolute terms, this growth is more marginal. What I would like also to put your attention to is the relation between international trade in itself and international trade politics. The business side has traditionally been a little distant to look at what happens in the global trade policy arena, what is happening in the multilateral trade negotiations within the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and what is called the Doha Development Agenda, the present negotiation that has been more or less in a stalemate for the last, I would say, 5-6 years, since 2006, more or less. So what is the alternative to a deadlock in the multilateral trade negotiations? That could be the preferential trade agreements that have mushroomed in different parts of the world, and particularly in East and Southeast Asia. In the academic world, we are a little ambiguous about this trend. I have many colleagues, very well-known trade economists, who believe that this is not a good way to promote international trade, to go for the second best, the regional trade agreements and various parts of geographically limited arrangements at a whole. On the other hand, there are others who believe that, well, this is better than nothing. A good preferential trade agreement could pave the way for a better multilateral trade agreement later. But what we can see right now is a very clear trend to promote various preferential trade agreements in Asia. I would particularly look at various agreements that relate to mainland China. For instance, there has been a new initiative on free trade between China, Japan, and Korea recently. I would say that this is a long-term endeavor. It will not happen within the nearest decade, but the signs are very clear here that this is something that will happen. An enormous, giant free trade agreement between the largest economies in Northeast Asia. And also the various free trade agreements between China on one hand and the ASEAN countries bilaterally and also regionally, particularly Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia, but also the emerging economies within ASEAN. So ASEAN, the 10 countries, are a very, I would say, strong force here. So finally, I would say that from the Swedish side, once again, Sweden is very much embedded in the the regional production networks of Europe, and we will continue to be there. But at the same time, we should also take a note on the long-term shift to Asia and the risk of becoming more marginalized and more peripherally located than we have been in the past. So from the EU external trade policy side, it is important to have a proactive role, a proactive stance here. EU started to launch what was called a Global Europe program in 2006. It was followed up in 2010 with a couple of arrangements to promote EU trade with Asian countries. And that has resulted in, I would say, very modest efforts so far. Although EU concluded a free trade agreement with Korea that came into operation last year, and it's a good chance also that there will be a trade agreement with India and with a couple of ASEAN countries, particularly Singapore, but maybe also Malaysia in the nearest future. So my message is that the business side should not be too ignorant about what happens in the free trade agreement talks. They might matter a lot for business and for separate industries, although the tariff levels are low. From that point of view, the multilateral talks have been very successful in the past. However, it's not the tariff levels that are the biggest problem. It's various types of technical barriers to trade and non-tariff barriers that matter. So all these trade talks that are, so to say, happening above our heads, these should be absolutely taken much more seriously and much more long-term, and also be watched when it comes to different scenarios. So to conclude, my main message is that yes, world trade has right now a very good trend. Good prospects also for 2012 and 2013, although the growth rate is very much concentrated to other parts of the world than where we are. So we are becoming increasingly peripherally located than we have been, and this is, of course, a challenge for Swedish industry. So this is my starting point, my main message, and I'm sure that there are a lot of aspects that could also be discussed in depth, but this is the start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claes. Please stay on the stage. Stay here, Claes, for just one or two questions after your speech. Thank you very much. Now you talk about recovering global trade, but it's concentrated to other areas than Europe. We have big problems in Europe, especially in southern Europe, very concrete problems. How do you think they affect already now this sector?
Sure. The European economic growth has slowed down. We all know that, and that will also affect trade and investment for sure. But we should also keep in mind that it is Germany. I would say that the three main countries when it comes to understanding European trade are Germany, Germany, and Germany. The German economy is the key to understand the rest of Europe.
But what if Greece exits the euro, for example?
I see the Greek problems as a political crisis right now rather than an economic crisis.
Okay.
And once again, the Greek economy is marginal when it comes to European trade and European economy as a whole.
Yes.
But the political effects of the Greek problems and the problems in other parts of southern Europe should of course not be underrated. Mm. But as long as there is a robust German economic growth, then I'm not that worried.
We're all dependent on Germany. Now we have another keypad question for you concerning the situation in Europe. So please, yes, here it is. If the present critical situation in the EU is not resolved soon, or if it escalates, what are the risks for your businesses? Is it insignificant, minor, moderate, major, or severe? Please give your vote now. So we'll see here, Claes, if they agree with you that it's merely a political risk, maybe not so significant for their business. Let's see what you have answered. It's, well, it is